Hello, all. And today we're going to be talking about something a little bit different, I think. Since I really don't have a clear format for this podcast, we just kind of talk about anything and everything that comes into my head. So I thought we would talk about one of my favorite things, the Haunted Mansion. Oh, yes. One of my absolute favorite Disneyland ride attractions. I first went on this ride when I was about 5. I went on it with my dad, and it was so spooky. It's one of my favorite things. And I've kind of been obsessed with it ever since. So today, or tonight rather, good to talk about ghost things in the night, I thought we would kind of discuss one of my favorite aspects of this ride. It's the Bride in the Attic. Now, I might be going into some other characters because there's a lot of conflicting things about who's actually who in the Haunted Mansion, and there's a lot of lore packed into that one ride. You don't actually see this with any of the other Disney attractions. I mean, you might see, people talking about like, oh, there's this story over here about this ride or this story over here, but there's not as much like folklore and mystery surrounding any of the other attractions as much as there is the Haunted Mansion. And I think that's because, it involves ghosts, and where something is spooky, haunted tales just kind of crop up. So, there's a lot of versions of the Bride in the Attic, and the reason I want to talk about her is because I think she's one of the most fascinating characters that actually holds a place in the Haunted Mansion. So she is in the attic. So for those of you that have gone on the ride, this is after we leave the ballroom. And after we leave the ballroom, we go into this unfinished attic. And there is just this figure in a white wedding dress. And she's there, and she's super spooky. I think by my count, they've done a few revamps of the Bride in the Attic over the years. I think there's about 8 incarnations if you don't count Melanie Ravenswood in Phantom Manor in Florida and the Bride in the Attic in Tokyo Disney. So that's something to keep in mind. I think right now, at the very least, I'm going to just be talking about Disneyland and their incarnations of the Bride in the Attic. So the very first incarnation, when this whole thing started, her name was Priscilla. And she was the very first incarnation. So she was married to a wealthy sea captain named Bartholomew Gore, or Gideon Gorlau, depending on the version of the tale. While he was away on a sea voyage, Priscilla opened an old sea chest in the mansion's attic and found that her husband was a notorious, bloodthirsty pirate. When she confronted him with the truth, she met a gruesome end at his hands. But how that happens is unclear. Some say Gore drowned Priscilla in a well on the mansion grounds, and if you look down into it, you can see that the water is blood red. Others say that Gore walled Priscilla up in a chimney, then continued his pirating ways, but forever haunted by her vengeful ghost, until he himself was doomed at sea. In the mansion, he appears in his captain's room, laughing an insane laugh, drenched in seawater, while shellfish and seaweed cling to him. She, on the other hand, will appear from out of the chimney in a skeletal figure, screaming. Others say, however, that Priscilla haunted Gore and drove him mad, and he hung himself in the mansion's cupola, becoming the ghost host. But it is also quite possible that Gore never owned the mansion and drowned in the basement when it flooded while on a quest completely unrelated to Priscilla. Now, those of you that have read a lot of folklore, like, this is very Bluebeard in nature. So this was the very first one that they did. So I imagine that the bride that we see in the attic, who was essentially, she was just a skeleton in a white dress that they had sort of draped this veil over, and it was really spooky. That's not the version that I remember seeing when I was a kid, but that's the very first incarnation of the bride in the attic. So the second incarnation, which they put in, I guess, in 1969, is Sally Little. She's also corpse-like with a beating heart, thus the name Beating Heart Bride is another one of the monikers the bride in the attic goes by. So she's holding a bouquet and a candle. Daughter of a wealthy man named Caleb Little, she planned to elope with Jonathan O'Hannon, but her father would not approve the match, saying, "You will never be together as long as I live." Sally died of a broken heart, and soon after her father's death, John, now an old man, dug up her body, now a skeleton with a glowing red heart, and married her in a private ceremony. That one's also fun. It's kind of enjoyable to read about it. How devoted John was. How lovely. All right, so the third incarnation. Her name may or may not be Lillian. There is some conflicting evidence. Some people seem to believe that the bride in the attic is also the tightrope walker that we see in the stretching room. I don't know about that. I actually need to do some more research on that, because one of the best things about the Haunted Mansion is that, like most ghost stories, it gets told and retold over and over again, so we don't really know what the truth is. But let's say that it is Lillian for the sake of this episode. But she has no face, and she's got a shadow-like visage with yellow eyes and a blue hue. Possibly the Hatbox Ghost's murderer. That's also been speculated about this third incarnation, who may or may not be Lillian. She has the decapitated heads of grooms stored in hat boxes around the attic. The ghosts of these men pop out from these boxes crying, "I do!" The April-December portrait could be this bride, showing her true nature under the beauty. And I actually forgot about that, so that's something I need to keep in mind. April-December could also be Lillian. That's a very interesting thing to think about. For those of you that don't know, the April-December portrait is one of the changing portraits that we see in the gallery before I think we hit the stretching room. Or it's after. It's one of the two. It's been a long time since I've been on the Haunted Mansion ride, so the fourth incarnation is Emily Kavanagh. She's young, innocent, and tragic looking. This is the bride that I saw in the attic when I was a kid. She was the 15-year-old girl who Master Gracie planned to marry. Before her wedding, she was playing hide-and-seek in the attic and was locked in the chest she was hiding in by Madame Leota, where she suffocated to death. And I have a lot to say about Madame Leota, but not on this episode. I love Madame Leota, I always have, but man, they do her dirty in the lore. It's not fair. But anyway, the fifth incarnation, the Bleeding Bride, is Emily DeClaire. She's got greenish skin and wild flowing hair. She was to marry William Gracie. Their courtship was swift, but filled with romantic intensity, and soon they were engaged to be married. On the day of her wedding, she was frightened to death by the ghosts of William Gracie's former crew, who revealed to her the crimes he had committed while he was the infamous Captain Blood. And here we're getting more of that, Captain Gore callback to the original incarnation. After her death, she remained as a ghost, staring out the window nightly, looking for her absent husband. Emily, by the way, is probably the most popular, I think. I see a lot of pictures of her everywhere. I think a lot of people enjoy her as the bride in the attic. And I have to agree, she's a lot of fun, but she's not my favorite. So the sixth incarnation is either Millie or Alice. She has glowing eyes, but the face is covered in a thick wedding veil. The story that I remember reading from my childhood, and this bride was up in her room trying on her wedding gown, and a man selling beautiful hats was up there with her. The bride's soon-to-be husband caught them together and assumed that they were having a secret affair. Flying into a jealous rage, he picked up an axe and decapitated the hat salesman, then turned on his wife. Gripping her tightly, he throttled her, then tossed her out of the window, and she died there on the pavement. Her wedding ring, having flown off her hand, is still embedded in the concrete where her body fell. Afterward, the distraught Master Gracie hung himself from the rafters in the mansion's foyer, and he has been presiding as the ghost host ever since. I don't remember where I remember reading this as a kid, but I do know that there is a lot of lore surrounding the wedding ring on the outside of the mansion, which I'm gonna kill it for everybody, unfortunately. The ring is actually just an exposed pipe that they kind of forgot to cover up in the front of the mansion, but you know what? Everyone has taken it as, it's canon, it's the bride's ring, that's where it fell, that's where it lay, and you know what? We are not going to disrupt it. It is 100% canon. It's not a pipe, it's a ring. Anyway, moving on. So, the seventh incarnation could be Elizabeth Henshaw, originally the 2003 bride, but I think when they did Nuptial Doom a few years ago, I think it is a rewrite of this bride from the film, and it is done so much better. So the Haunted Mansion film that was released in 2003 was an absolute just disaster of a film. I hate it. And I know it's in that really weird vein where they were like, well, the Pirates of the Caribbean ride was, we turned it into a film and it was very popular, and we kind of gave it a funny kind of a spin. Maybe we should do the same thing with the Haunted Mansion. It's like, guys, it was just a shit comedy. It wasn't very good. Poor Eddie Murphy being forced into that script. That poor guy. But anyway, Elizabeth Henshaw. If Nuptial Doom is a rewrite of this character, then she is the daughter of a rich nobleman from one of his many servants, a girl of mixed race. When a mysterious sea captain comes to her father's house, both she and he are in love the second they lay eyes on each other. But her father did not approve. When the captain asked for her hand in marriage, the nobleman deferred, saying that if he could build his daughter the finest mansion, he would agree to the marriage. So he did, and the nobleman had no choice but to agree. There is much more to the story. I'm not going to relay the whole thing, but it is known that the nobleman continued to interfere with the nuptial arrangements and told his daughter that her husband died at sea. Distressed and dressed in her wedding gown, the bride ran all the way to the mansion, where she lit a candle and waited for her husband's return. Her father and a group of his friends rushed to the mansion to find her, but when they arrived in the attic, the door was locked and could not be opened. When the sea captain returned, upon hearing the news, he rushed to the mansion, whereupon the attic door opened freely at his hand. But all there was a torn wedding gown and a burnt-out candle. Grief-stricken, the captain shut himself inside the mansion, and it wasn't until much later that a brave few dared to break in and saw the captain's body hung from the rafters. So this is kind of interesting because this is also a callback to Master Gracie, being the Lord of the Mansion and also being a captain and possibly a pirate at the same time. And we have a couple incarnations of him, hanging himself from the rafters, but everybody says that he's not the ghost host, that he's actually a completely unrelated character that's part of the Sinister 11. Which are portraits that we see in the Haunted Mansion. And I don't buy it personally, that's just me. I think that the ghost host is Master Gracie. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me and they're going to be like, no, that's not true. You know what? I don't think so. There's too many other stories that are floating around. There's Nuptial Doom. There is the first incarnation of Priscilla, and I know that Disney does a lot of rewrites. It's sort of like they're trying to expunge the original lore, but if you think that the ghost host is a separate spirit, that's totally fine too. I just personally don't buy it. Anyway, the last bride, Constance Hatchaway, the Black Widow. She is the 8th incarnation, and she has 5 hat boxes piled up across the attic, and a nearby coat rack holds the hats of her departed husbands. She wears 5 strings of pearls, symbolizing her 5 marriages. She died somewhere around 1910 to 1930 as an old woman. Her portrait appears in the Ghost Gallery. A lot of people say that she is in the stretching room, that she's the woman who's sitting on top of the tombstone. This is another one I don't buy, though. I don't know. I mean, if I was going to come back from the afterlife, I guess I too would come back as like a 22-year-old Constance Hatchaway, young and beautiful, and definitely murdered all of her husbands. But I don't think it is. I actually think that the woman in the portrait hall is a completely different woman. And we have some lore on that as well, so it's why I don't buy it. I don't think that's Constance. And I also don't really like this incarnation of the bride. This whole, Black Widow, I murdered all of my husbands. Like, she's just not as much fun as the other brides, but that's probably me. The fun thing about The Bride in the Attic is that there is a bride for everyone. You've got your, I guess I'd call it feminist empowerment. I kill my husband's Constance. There's Millie or Emily. You've got your tragic brides. And I am personally more of a fan of the tragic bride. Anyway, guys, that is all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed my little excursion. Anyway, I will see you all later. Good night.